There are moments when time doesn't stop, it fractures. When the air in a room crystallizes and every breath becomes visible evidence of before and after. Minjun had built an empire on the speed of his reactions, on violence delivered before his enemies could blink. But on the night his ex-girlfriend slipped poison into his pregnant wife's champagne glass at a charity gala, surrounded by Seoul's elite and 100 phone cameras, he did something that terrified everyone who knew him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply watched the liquid catch the light as it fell, and in that frozen moment, everyone in that ballroom realized they were watching a man capable of something far worse than rage. One small thing before we continue. If this kind of story makes you lean closer instead of clicking away, do me a favor, subscribe. Say something in the comments, even just a word. Tells me I'm not telling these stories alone. Alright, back to the story. The Shilla Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into liquid gold. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from cathedral ceilings, each crystal prism scattering light across faces that cost more to maintain than most people's homes. Champagne flowed. Pearls gleamed against collarbones. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves, the kind that signals wealth, not joy. This was Seoul's annual winter charity gala, where the city's most powerful pretended philanthropy justified their excess. Minjun stood near the marble pillar he'd chosen specifically for its sightlines. From here he could see every entrance, every server, every guest who mattered. Old habits. The kind that kept you breathing when you'd spent the first 30 years of your life in rooms where trust was currency you couldn't afford. But tonight, his attention kept drifting to the woman in the champagne-colored gown across the room. Kiana, his wife, 6 months pregnant, glowing in that way people always describe, but he'd never truly understood until he saw it illuminate her from within. She was laughing at something her friend Ji-won was saying, one hand resting unconsciously on the swell of their child. The gesture was so natural, so unguarded, it made his chest tighten. 3 years ago, she'd walked into his legitimate investment office, the front he'd built to distance himself from the blood money, with a proposal for a youth arts program. She'd looked him directly in the eye and said, "I know who you were. I'm interested in who you're becoming." She was the first person who'd ever drawn that line. Who you were. Who you're becoming. Not who you are. That subtle difference had rewritten his life. The MC's voice echoed through the ballroom, calling for a toast to the evening's sponsors. Crystal stems rose in unison. Minjun lifted his own glass, his eyes still on Soo-yeon. She caught his gaze across the room and smiled, that private smile that belonged only to him, to the version of himself she'd believed in before he'd fully believed in it himself. That's when he saw her. Lee Yuna, his ex. The woman he'd left behind when he'd started building his exit from the underworld. She materialized beside Kiana like a ghost given form, elegant in crimson silk, holding 2 champagne flutes, close enough to touch, close enough that no one would think twice about 2 women at a gala exchanging glasses. But Minjun knew Yuna, knew the precision in her movements, knew the calm in her smile. Time became elastic, stretching each second into an eternity. He watched Yuna's fingers release the stem of one glass, watched Kiana's hand rise to accept it, watched the liquid catch the light, clear, golden, beautiful, watched something darker swirl beneath the surface, just for a moment, like ink diffusing through water, watched Kiana's lips begin to part, the glass moving toward her mouth. The entire room erupted in applause and cheers. The toast. Glasses tilting, people drinking. Minjun's mind processed everything in the space between heartbeats. The way Yuna's eyes found his across the crowd. The small smile. The challenge. She wanted him to see. Needed him to see. This wasn't stealth. This was performance. His body understood what his mind would take another moment to accept. And then Kiana drank. The world didn't stop. It splintered into 1,000 fragmented moments, each one sharp enough to cut. Kiana's smile flickered, just slightly. Her hand tightened around the champagne flute. The silk of her gown shifted as her breathing changed. Not dramatic, not collapsing, just hesitating. Her body asking a question it shouldn't have to ask. Minjun stood 20 feet away, every muscle in his body screaming at him to move, to run. to tear through the crowd and reach her, to wrap his hands around Yuna's throat and squeeze until the light left her eyes the way she was trying to extinguish the light in his. He'd killed for less, much less. Everyone who mattered in this room knew it. And he didn't move. The marble was cold beneath his fingers where he gripped his own untouched champagne glass. Around him, the gala continued its orchestrated joy. No one else had noticed. Not yet. Just him and Yuna, locked in a moment of understanding that transcended words. She'd just poisoned his pregnant wife in front of Seoul's most powerful witnesses. And she was waiting to see what kind of man he'd become. Minjun's world narrowed to a single point of focus. Not Kiana. Not the champagne glass. Not even the poison he knew was already working its way through her system. Yuna. He watched her hand release the champagne flute with the kind of precision surgeons use. Calculated. Practiced. The movement so smooth it appeared accidental to anyone not looking for it. But Minjun had spent 15 years reading violence in the milliseconds before it arrived. He knew intention when he saw it. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't quicken. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze across the 20 feet of marble and silk and oblivious wealth that separated them. And she smiled. Not the vicious grin of someone who'd just committed violence. Something worse. Something peaceful. She wasn't afraid. Not of him. Not of consequences. Not of the fact that she'd just poisoned a pregnant woman in front of 200 witnesses. The lack of fear told him everything. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't rage. This was a message delivered with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute certainty. She'd planned this, chosen this venue, this moment, these witnesses. She wanted the cameras, wanted the crowd, wanted him to see it happen and know he was helpless to stop it. This was public execution masquerading as accident. Minjun's body understood what his mind was still processing. Every muscle in his frame went still. Not the stillness of shock. The stillness of a predator that's just located prey. His fingers remained loose around his champagne glass. His shoulders didn't tense. His jaw didn't clench. He didn't move. Around him, the gala continued its choreographed celebration. Laughter. Clinking crystal. The string quartet transitioning into something bright and meaningless. But in the space between him and Yuna, the air had changed. People felt it before they understood it. Park Jin-ho, a banker who'd laundered money for the Kongpei syndicate, stopped mid-sentence. Cho Mi-sun, whose husband had disappeared after crossing Minjun 3 years ago, turned her head. Kim Sang-woo, who'd once witnessed Minjun break a man's jaw for spilling a drink on his jacket, took an involuntary step backward. They knew him, knew his history, knew that stillness from him was like silence before thunder. Lee Sang-mi whispered something to her companion, eyes darting between Minjun and the two women near the champagne fountain. Minjun felt their stares, felt the attention shifting, the collective holding of breath. This was a man who'd once walked into a rival's wedding and removed him from his own reception before dessert was served, who'd sent 3 men to the hospital for looking too long at his car, who'd built his reputation on reactions so swift and brutal they became cautionary tales told to new foot soldiers. Immediate, violent, absolute. That's who they knew. So when he stood motionless, watching his pregnant wife's hand drift toward her temple, watching her try to maintain her smile even as her body began betraying her, the room understood something was profoundly wrong. They misread it as shock, as the great Minjun finally encountering something that could freeze him. Some saw weakness. Others saw hesitation. The younger guests pulled out phones, sensing drama worth documenting. None of them understood what Yuna understood. None of them could see what was happening behind his eyes. Minjun was doing mathematics, calculating variables, measuring distances and angles and consequences. His mind had already moved past reaction into strategy, past emotion into architecture. He wasn't frozen. He was deciding. Kiana's champagne glass slipped slightly in her fingers. She caught it, steadied herself, smiled at Ji-won with practiced grace even as confusion flickered across her features. Minjun watched his wife fight to stay standing. Watched Yuna watch him watch it happen. And still he didn't move. The marble beneath his feet felt like bedrock. Immovable, ancient. He'd built his entire life on speed, on being the fastest hand in any room, the quickest to violence, the first to blood. But his wife had asked him once, late at night with her head on his chest, what if being powerful means knowing when not to move? He'd laughed then, kissed her forehead, thought it was philosophy from someone who'd never needed to survive his world. Now he understood. If he had reacted, if he'd crossed that ballroom floor, if he'd put his hands on Yuna, if he'd given them the monster they expected, this would have made sense. But what terrified the room, what sent whispers racing through the crowd faster than the poison racing through Kiana's bloodstream, was how calm he became, how still, how absolutely devastatingly certain. 3 months earlier, the clinic waiting room smelled like lavender and lies, the kind of artificial calm designed to make people forget they were anxious. Minjun sat in a chair too small for his frame, holding a tablet displaying fetal development milestones he'd already memorized. Kiana emerged from the examination room, ultrasound images clutched in her hand like proof of something miraculous. Her eyes found his immediately. Healthy, she said, just that one word. But the way she said it, relief and wonder braided together, made his chest constrict. He stood, crossed to her, took the images gently and studied the grainy black and white evidence of their child. The curve of spine, the suggestion of fingers. The doctor says everything's progressing perfectly, Kiana continued, her hand drifting to the small swell beneath her blouse. Strong heartbeat, right on schedule. Minjun traced the outline of the baby's head with his finger. This small, this fragile, depending entirely on him to keep the world safe enough for arrival. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like direction. 2 months earlier, night in their apartment. The city lights filtered through sheer curtains, painting everything in shades of blue and amber. Minjun lay awake, his hand resting on Kiana's stomach, feeling the subtle movements beneath his palm. The baby was active tonight, restless. You're not asleep, Kiana murmured, her voice thick with drowsiness. Neither are you. She turned slightly, fitting herself more comfortably against him. Can't sleep when someone's doing gymnastics in there. His palm followed a ripple of movement across her abdomen. Strong. Stubborn, she corrected, a smile in her voice. Wonder where that comes from. They lay in comfortable silence. Then Kiana's hand covered his, pressing it more firmly against her skin. Hi, little one, she whispered, speaking to the curve of her belly. That's your father's hand. The one that's going to teach you to ride a bike, to tie your shoes, to be strong without needing to prove it. Minjunes Hochzeitsend. She did this often. Talked to the baby when she thought he'd drifted off. As if these conversations were private, meant only for the child. But he heard every word, memorized them. Your father used to think power meant making people afraid, she continued softly. But he learned something better. He learned that real strength is choosing who you want to be, every single day, even when the old choices would be easier. She thought he was asleep. He'd never been more awake. 1 month earlier, they were having dinner. Something simple, pasta she'd made while he pretended not to hover in the kitchen doorway. Kiana had a way of moving through their home that made it feel like a place worth protecting rather than just a space to occupy. I met with the youth center board today, she said, twirling linguine around her fork. They want to expand the arts program. Whatever funding you need. She looked at him over the rim of her wine glass. Sparkling cider now, since the pregnancy. I wasn't asking for money. I know. I was just telling you because it matters to me. That's why I'm offering. A small smile played at her lips. You're learning. He'd learned a lot from her. Learned that silence could be strength. That walking away could take more courage than staying. That power meant nothing if you couldn't control yourself first. She'd never asked him to change. Never demanded he abandon his contacts, his reputation, the infrastructure he'd built. She understood that men like him didn't transform overnight into something unrecognizable. Didn't expect redemption, as if his past was something to be cleansed. Instead, she'd looked at him during their 3rd dinner together and said, I'm not interested in fixing you. I'm interested in the direction you're already moving. Direction, not destination. She'd seen in him what he hadn't yet seen in himself, that he'd already started becoming someone different. The legitimate businesses weren't a disguise. The charity work wasn't performance. He'd been building an exit for years before he met her. Building toward something that looked like a life instead of survival. Kiana simply recognized what he was too close to see. She knew who he'd been. She'd done her research before that first coffee. Knew about the violence, the territory disputes, the bodies that never produced witnesses. She wasn't naive. Wasn't some innocent who'd stumbled into his world and stayed out of ignorance. She'd chosen him knowing exactly what she was choosing. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, watching him over dinner. The truth was too large for words. That she'd given him something he didn't know he needed. Not forgiveness. Not acceptance. Something more fundamental. Permission to become. "You," he said simply. She reached across the table, laced her fingers through his. Good answer. Present. The Gala. Standing in that ballroom, watching poison work through his wife's system, Minjun understood what she'd given him. Not just love. Not just the child growing inside her. She'd trusted his restraint. Trusted that the man she'd chosen was stronger than the man everyone expected. She didn't believe he could change. She believed he already had. And that belief, that absolute certainty in who he was becoming, was the only thing keeping his hands steady as he watched her suffer. The only thing preventing him from crossing that marble floor and showing Yuna exactly who he used to be. Minjun's first movement was so slight that only 3 people in the ballroom noticed. His left hand rose to his ear, adjusting his earpiece as if it had slipped. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing. A minor adjustment. Discomfort with formal wear. But Park Dong-hyun, head of security standing near the north entrance, received the signal clearly. Code medical. Silent protocol. Now, Dong-hyun's hand went to his own earpiece. No words. Just a double-tap acknowledgement. Then he moved, not toward Minjun but toward the service corridor. His pace casual enough not to alarm guests but purposeful enough that his team would understand. Minjun lowered his hand, turned slightly, lifted his champagne glass toward his lips without drinking. Another gesture that meant nothing to the crowd and everything to the people who mattered. Jung Hae-jin, events coordinator in a black dress that allowed her to blend with the catering staff, saw it. She touched her tablet screen once, twice. In the kitchen, an entirely different kind of response team received new orders. No sirens. No announcement. No spectacle. Just precision. Across the ballroom, Kiana's smile had become a mask. She stood beside Ji-won, nodding at something being said, but her free hand had drifted to the high-backed chair beside her. Not leaning. Not yet. Just locating support in case gravity stopped cooperating. The champagne glass trembled in her other hand. Are you all right? Ji-won's voice carried concern. You look pale. Just warm, Kiana managed, her voice steady. Years of diplomatic training, of charity galas, of performing grace under scrutiny. The crowd. But her pupils had dilated. A fine sheen of perspiration gathered at her temples. Her breathing had shifted. Shallow, controlled, like someone trying not to panic their way into worse panic. She knew something was wrong. She just didn't know what yet. Yuna watched Minjun from across the room. Waiting. Her champagne glass dangled from elegant fingers. Her posture relaxed. She'd positioned herself with clear sight lines to both Minjun and his wife. This was theater. She was both director and audience. She waited for the explosion. The moment he'd crossed that marble floor. The moment his control would shatter and everyone would see what she already knew. That men like him didn't change. They only pretended. And when the pretense fell away, when something precious was threatened, the monster would emerge. She waited for his hands to become fists, for his jaw to clench, for his eyes to find hers with the promise of violence. But he didn't look at her. Not once. His attention seemed scattered. A glance toward the entrance. A look at his phone. A subtle shift in posture as if he'd grown bored with the proceedings. He appeared distracted, disengaged. It unsettled her more than rage would have. Two servers in white jackets emerged from the service entrance. They carried silver trays but moved with the kind of efficient purpose that had nothing to do with canapes. They split, one heading toward the south wall, another positioning near the fountain where Kiana stood. A woman in a navy dress, someone Yuna had never seen before, materialized beside Kiana. Not a guest, something else. She carried a clutch purse and spoke to Kiana with the easy familiarity of an old friend, except they'd never met. "Mrs. Kong, I've been looking everywhere for you," the woman said warmly, taking Kiana's elbow with practiced gentleness. "Could I steal you for just a moment? There's something you absolutely must see." Kiana's confusion flickered, but the woman's grip was firm, kind but insistent. Ji-won watched them go, puzzled but not alarmed. Min-jun tracked the movement in his peripheral vision. Kiana being guided toward the private sitting room off the main ballroom. The room where medical staff were already waiting with equipment that looked nothing like party decorations. His champagne glass remained steady in his hand. His expression revealed nothing. He took one step, not toward Kiana, not toward Yuna, but toward a cluster of businessmen discussing quarterly projections. Joined their conversation with a nod. Made a comment about market volatility that earned polite laughter. Every instinct screamed at him to run to his wife, to push past the careful choreography and reach her, to demand answers from Yuna, to feel her throat beneath his hands and squeeze until truth or apology emerged. But he'd learned something from Kiana, learned that power wasn't always loud, that control sometimes meant trusting others to act while you remained perfectly still. His phone buzzed. A text from Donghyun, medical on site, secured, proceeding. Min-jun didn't check the message. Didn't need to. He felt it arrive. Knew what it meant. Yuna's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. She'd expected chaos by now. Sirens. Security descending. A scene that would dominate tomorrow's news cycle and destroy everything Min-jun had built. The reformed gangster who couldn't control himself when it mattered. The violent past catching up to the civilized present. Instead, the gala continued. String quartet playing. Guests mingling. Laughter in all the right places. And Min-jun stood among them. The picture of a man at ease, making small talk about investments while his pregnant wife disappeared through a side door. He still hadn't looked at Yuna. Hadn't acknowledged her presence. Hadn't given her the satisfaction of his attention. She'd poisoned his wife, his unborn child, in front of 200 witnesses, and he was discussing real estate trends. For the first time since she'd released that champagne glass, Yuna felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that she'd miscalculated something fundamental about the man she thought she knew. If the story has you hooked, you already know what to do. Subscribe, leave a comment with the moment that caught you, and share it with someone who'd enjoy the ride. Let's go. Yuna had chosen the poison carefully. Not in the private sitting room where Kiana now fought to stay conscious. Not in the moment she'd slipped it into the champagne glass. But 3 weeks earlier, in a consultation room that smelled of antiseptic and discretion. Speaking with a chemist who didn't ask questions if the price was right. "I need something visible," she'd said. "But survivable." The chemist had raised an eyebrow. "Those are contradictory requirements." "No. They're precise ones." She'd needed symptoms dramatic enough to alarm. The pallor, the trembling, the labored breathing. Enough to trigger emergency response. Enough to make headlines. But calibrated to avoid permanent damage with proper treatment. This was never about murder. Murder was simple, crude. The tool of people who hadn't thought past the immediate satisfaction of watching someone fall. Yuna had thought much further than that. She stood in the ballroom, champagne glass cooling in her hand, watching Min-jun perform normalcy, watching him smile at investors, nod at colleagues, maintain the careful facade of a man who'd left violence behind. The facade she'd come to destroy. For 2 years, she'd watched him build this new life, watched him donate to children's charities, attend gallery openings, speak at business conferences about second chances and choosing different paths. Watched the media rehabilitation, The careful rebranding from gangster to legitimate businessman. Watched everyone believe it. But she knew better. Had known him when power meant broken bones and territories claimed in blood. When restraint was weakness and hesitation got you killed. You didn't erase that. Didn't transform from predator to philanthropist just because you fell in love and wanted to play house. Men like Minjun didn't change. They just waited for the right pressure to reveal what they'd always been. So she designed the perfect pressure point. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Scenario 1, he retaliates immediately. Crosses that ballroom floor and puts his hands on her in front of 200 witnesses and countless cameras. Every phone would capture it. Every news outlet would run it. The reformed gangster, the man who'd spent years building legitimacy, reduced to violence the moment something precious was threatened. Proof that change was performance. That beneath the expensive suit and charitable donations lived the same brutal enforcer who'd once ruled through fear. His future would collapse under the weight of his past. Scenario 2, he explodes later. Can't maintain the facade. The poison works slowly enough that everyone sees his wife's distress. Sees his control fracture. Maybe he makes it an hour before the rage takes over. Maybe he waits until the ambulance arrives. But eventually the explosion comes. The public breakdown. The loss of composure. And the narrative writes itself. Man can't handle crisis, resorts to violence, proves he was always a liability waiting to happen. Every investor would distance themselves. Every partnership would dissolve. Every carefully constructed bridge to legitimacy would burn. Scenario 3, he freezes. Does nothing. Lets his pregnant wife suffer while he stands paralyzed by indecision or fear. The strong man, the protector, the reformed criminal who claimed he'd changed, revealed as impotent in the moment that mattered most. Whispers would start. Questions about his capabilities. His judgment. Whether someone so easily neutralized deserved the power he'd accumulated. Weakness would erode his empire more slowly than violence, but just as thoroughly. 3 scenarios. 3 different paths to the same destination. The destruction of everything he'd built. Yuna had gamed them all out. Spent weeks considering variables. Planning contingencies. She'd accounted for immediate retaliation, delayed response, legal intervention, even the possibility he'd try to flee. What she hadn't accounted for was this. Him doing nothing and somehow making it feel intentional. Controlled. As if his stillness was choice rather than paralysis. She watched him laugh at someone's joke. Watched him check his phone with the casual disinterest of a man not currently experiencing a crisis. Watched him navigate the room as if his world wasn't fracturing. It didn't make sense. The poison was working. She'd seen Kiana's pallor, the trembling in her hands. Medical response would already be underway. The crisis was real. The stakes were absolute. So why did he look like a man in complete control? The truth crystallized slowly, unwillingly, in the back of Yuna's mind. She'd designed a test with 3 possible outcomes. But she'd forgotten that the most dangerous people don't choose from the options you give them. They create new ones. A waiter passed with a tray of fresh champagne. Yuna set her empty glass down, accepted a full one. Her hand was steady, but her mind was racing, recalculating. This wasn't about killing Kiana. It was never about killing Kiana. Pregnant women, unborn children. Those were lines even Yuna wouldn't cross. The poison was calibrated. Survivable with treatment. She'd planned it that way. She didn't want blood. She wanted his future. Wanted to strip away the carefully constructed persona and show the world who Minjun really was. Wanted investors to see. Partners to see. The media to see. Wanted his transformation revealed as fiction. Because if he could truly change, if people like them could actually become something different, then what did that say about her? About the choices she'd made? About the life she'd built on the foundation that people were fixed things, that nature always won over nurture, that you were what you were and everything else was delusion. If he could change, she'd have to face that she'd chosen not to. So she'd come to prove he hadn't. She didn't come to take a life. She came to take his legacy. And watching him now, calm and controlled while emergency protocols unfolded invisibly around him, Yuna felt the first whisper of doubt that maybe, impossibly infuriatingly, She'd underestimated what he'd become. Minjun positioned himself where the light was best. Not in shadow. Not tucked away in a corner where grief or rage might excuse themselves from scrutiny. He stood in the center of the ballroom's main thoroughfare, beneath a chandelier that made his face completely visible to every guest, every camera, every phone pointed in his direction. He wanted to be seen. The whispers started within minutes. Did you see his wife leave? She looked ill. Someone said she was poisoned. No, that's absurd. Who would? At a charity gala? He's just standing there. Why isn't he? Maybe he doesn't know? He knows. Look at him. He knows. Minjun heard every word. They weren't subtle. Weren't trying to be. Shock had a way of making people forget their manners, forget that discretion wasn't just about volume but proximity. He let them talk. Let the speculation build and twist and multiply into theories that would sound ridiculous tomorrow but felt true in the confusion of the moment. Lee Sangmi approached with her husband, faces arranged in careful concern. Minjun, she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. Is Kiana all right? We saw her leave with someone. She's fine, he said. Simple. Offering nothing. Are you sure? She looked. She's fine. The flatness of his tone should have ended the conversation. Instead, it fed it. Sangmi exchanged a glance with her husband. They retreated, already whispering to the next cluster of guests they encountered. More people approached, each with the same manufactured concern, each fishing for information they could turn into narrative. Minjun gave them nothing but presence. Across the room, Cho Jae-sung watched with barely concealed disgust. Jae-sung had been there 5 years ago, when Minjun's crew had taken over the Gangnam territory, had witnessed the efficient brutality, the message sent in broken ribs and hospitalized rivals. That man would have already crossed this ballroom, would have made Yuna understand the cost of her mistake in ways that required medical intervention. This man, this version standing under chandeliers making small talk? Pathetic, Jae-sung muttered to his associate. His pregnant wife is poisoned and he's discussing quarterly earnings. Maybe he's in shock? Men like him don't go into shock. They go into rage. Jae-sung shook his head. He's soft now. All this legitimate business, this playing at respectability, it's made him weak. The associate nodded, uncertain. But Jae-sung was certain. He'd seen enough men try to leave the life. Seen them build their walls of normalcy, their defenses of legal enterprise and charitable giving. And he'd seen what happened when those walls were tested. They always crumbled. Always. Park Jin-woo, who'd made his fortune in construction contracts that sometimes involved persuading landowners to sell, watched with different eyes. He's not frozen, Jin-woo said quietly to his wife. What? Look at his hands. His posture. He's not frozen. He's waiting. Waiting for what? Jin-woo didn't answer. Didn't know how to articulate the instinct that said the stillness was something other than paralysis. That Minjun's visible presence felt less like shock and more like documentation, like a man creating a public record of exactly where he was and what he was doing while something else unfolded elsewhere. I don't know, Jin-woo finally said, but I'm going to make sure we're very visible on the security footage tonight, being nowhere near wherever this ends. Yuna watched Minjun from her position near the fountain. 20 minutes had passed since Kiana's departure. 20 minutes of him standing in plain sight, accepting condolences and deflecting questions with minimal responses. 20 minutes of restraint that should have broken by now. Should have. Violence had always been his first language. The vocabulary he reached for before thought, before strategy. It's what made him effective. What made him feared. But he wasn't reaching for it. And slowly, terribly, Yuna began to understand that he wasn't going to. Violence wasn't coming. Something else was. She could see it in the way he held himself. Not the tension of a man holding back rage. The certainty of a man who'd already made a decision and was now simply executing it. Her champagne glass had gone warm in her hand. She'd expected immediate retaliation or public collapse. She'd planned for both. Had contingencies for either path. But this visible, documented restraint, This performance of control while his pregnant wife fought poison in another room, this created a different kind of record. The kind that would matter later in ways she was only beginning to calculate. Minjun checked his phone. A message from the medical team. Stable. Antidote administered. Proceeding with standard protocols. He allowed himself one full breath. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned his attention to the investment banker asking about his interest in renewable energy portfolios. Around him, the Gala continued its slow dissolution into gossip and speculation. He could feel the disappointment from certain quarters. People who'd wanted spectacle, wanted proof that transformation was impossible, wanted the monster to emerge and validate their cynicism. He denied them that satisfaction, stayed exactly where cameras could see him, let them misunderstand, let them think he was weak or in shock or broken by the moment. None of them knew what he had already decided. None of them understood that the most terrifying thing he could do was nothing at all. At least nothing they could see. The hospital corridor smelled like bleach and fear. Minjun sat in a chair designed for temporary use. Plastic, ergonomic, meant to discourage lingering. He'd been there for 2 hours. The Gala's noise had vanished completely. No champagne glasses. No string quartets. No polite laughter masking ambition and judgment. Just the clock. It hung on the wall opposite him, industrial and ugly. The second hand moved with a tick that felt deliberately loud. Each rotation a reminder of time passing. Of poison working or antidote fighting. Of his child's heartbeat either continuing or not. Tick, tick, tick. He'd built empires on controlling time. Knowing when to move, when to wait, when to strike before the other side realized they were already dead. Time had always been his weapon. Now it was just something that passed while he couldn't do anything to stop it. A nurse emerged from the emergency treatment room. Young, efficient looking. Her scrubs were printed with cheerful cartoon animals that felt obscene in this context.
Minjun stood.
His legs had gone stiff from sitting. She walked toward him, clipboard against her chest like armor. Her eyes went to the board, to her notes, to the wall behind him, anywhere but his face. Mr. Kong, she said, professional, careful. The doctor will be out shortly to speak with you. Is she? The doctor will be out shortly. The repetition was deliberate. A script she'd been trained to follow. Don't give information. Don't make promises. Don't meet the family member's eyes because eye contact creates connection and connection makes the bad news harder to deliver.
Minjun understood scripts.
Had written enough of them himself. And the baby? His voice came out rougher than intended. The nurse's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The doctor will be out shortly. I understand. She nodded once and retreated back through the doors that separated his world from the one where Kiana was fighting. He sat back down, pressed his wedding ring into his palm until the metal edge left an impression in his skin. The ring had been her grandmother's. Kiana had given it to him on their wedding day with instructions that felt more like prophecy. This survived a war. It'll survive whatever comes next. He'd laughed, asked if she was expecting a war. She'd just smiled. I'm expecting you to remember what matters when everything else is noise. He turned the ring around his finger now. Around and around. A nervous habit he'd never had before her. Before he had something worth being nervous about losing. The clock ticked. Minjun closed his eyes. He wasn't a religious man. Hadn't prayed since childhood, and even then it had been performative. Words recited because his mother had insisted, not because he'd believed anyone was listening. But now, in a hospital corridor with bleach smell and cartoon animals and a clock that wouldn't stop measuring his helplessness, he found himself doing something that felt like prayer, not for revenge. That part of him that wanted to find Yuna, wanted to make her understand consequences in ways that required surgical intervention. He set that aside, locked it away. That wasn't what this moment needed. Not for control. The instinct to fix, to manage, to bend the situation to his will through force of personality or money or connections. Useless here. The poison was already in Kiana's system. The doctors were already working. His power meant nothing against biology and chemistry and chance. So he prayed for something he'd never asked for before. Permission. Permission to be better than people expected. Better than who he'd been. Better than the version of himself that would have handled this with violence and intimidation and the certain knowledge that power solved everything. Permission to deserve the life Kiana had believed he could build. To deserve the child whose heartbeat depended on choices he hadn't made yet but would define everything that came after. Permission to prove that change wasn't performance. That the man she'd married was real. That the transformation everyone doubted had actually happened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't asking to win. He was asking to deserve what he might lose. The doors opened. A doctor emerged. Older. Tired eyes. The kind of tired that came from too many vigils. Too many plastic chairs. Too many people pressing wedding rings into their palms while they waited for news that would either rebuild or destroy their world.
Miljoens Tod.
His hands were steady, but his breath wasn't. The doctor's expression was carefully neutral. Another script, another professional distance. But then she looked at him directly, and something in her face shifted. "Mr. Kong," she said, "your wife is stable." The air returned to his lungs in a rush that felt like violence. "The baby? We're monitoring closely. The next few hours will be critical, but the fetal heart rate is strong. Preliminary indicators are good. Good. Not certain. Not safe. Not guaranteed. But good." He nodded. Couldn't speak. His throat had closed around words that suddenly seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what he was feeling. "She's asking for you," the doctor added. Minjun followed her through the doors, leaving the ticking clock and cartoon animals and plastic chair behind. His wedding ring had left a perfect circle pressed into his palm. He didn't stop turning it. Didn't stop praying. Didn't stop asking for permission to be the man his wife believed in, even if the world never would. The room was too bright. Medical equipment hummed and beeped in rhythms Minjun didn't understand. For lines, monitors, a blood pressure cuff that inflated and deflated on its own, squeezing Kiana's arm with mechanical indifference every few minutes. She looked small. That was the first thing that struck him. Kiana, who filled rooms with presence, who commanded attention without demanding it, who'd walked into his office 3 years ago and changed the trajectory of his life with nothing but certainty, reduced to something fragile beneath white hospital sheets. Her skin had lost its color. Not dramatically. Not the way movies made dying look. Just less, like someone had turned down the saturation on a photograph. The pregnancy curve beneath the blanket seemed impossibly vulnerable. Minjun stood in the doorway. The doctor had said he could go in. Had given him permission to sit beside his wife, to hold her hand, to be present for whatever came next. But his feet wouldn't move, because moving forward meant accepting this was real. That the woman who'd believed in his transformation now fought poison because someone wanted to prove transformation was impossible. That his past had reached forward and touched the only future that mattered. A nurse checked the monitors, made a note on a tablet, glanced at him standing frozen in the doorway. "You can sit," she said gently. "She's stable. You're not going to disturb anything." Stable. That word again. Not safe. Not recovered. Not out of danger. Just stable. He forced his feet to move. The chair beside the bed was padded, an upgrade from the plastic torture device in the corridor. He sat. The vinyl exhaled beneath his weight. Kiana's hand lay on top of the blanket. Palm up. Fingers slightly curled. He reached for it. Stopped. Started again. His hand, which had broken bones and signed contracts and held weapons and built empires, trembled as it closed around hers. Her skin was cool. Not cold. Not yet. But not the warmth he was used to. Not the heat she radiated at night when she pressed against him, stealing his body temperature and giving nothing back except the comfort of her presence. He sat holding her hand and listening to machines measure things he couldn't control. Time did its elastic trick again. Seconds stretched. Minutes compressed. He lost track of how long he'd been sitting there. Long enough for his back to ache. Long enough for a new nurse to come in, check the monitors, leave without speaking. Long enough for the light through the window to shift. Then Kiana's fingers twitched in his. So slight he almost missed it. Might have if he'd been looking anywhere else. but he'd been staring at their joined hands as if concentration alone could keep her tethered to consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered.
Min-yoon leaned forward.
Kiana. Another flutter. Her eyes opened partially, unfocused, struggling to find him through whatever fog the medication and poison and exhaustion had created. "I'm here," he said. His voice came out hoarse. "I'm right here." Her lips moved. No sound at first, just the shape of words trying to form. He leaned closer, close enough to feel her breath against his ear. "Stay." One word. Not a question. Not a plea. Just a statement of need reduced to its most essential form. "Stay. Don't leave this room. Don't chase revenge. Don't become who you were. Stay. Be the man I chose. Be the father our child needs. Stay." All of that compressed into a single syllable. Min-jun's forehead came down to rest against their joined hands. The position was awkward, uncomfortable. The bed rail pressed into his chest. The angle made his neck ache immediately. He didn't move. "I'm staying," he whispered against her knuckles.
I'm staying.
Her fingers tightened around his, barely, just enough for him to feel it. She'd used what energy she had to wake up, to say one word, to make sure he understood what mattered. Not justice, not revenge, not proving anything to anyone, just staying, being present for what came next instead of drowning in what had already happened. Her eyes closed again. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The 4 dripped its measured dosage. The blood pressure cuff inflated and released. Min-jun stayed in that uncomfortable position, forehead pressed against her hand, feeling her pulse beneath his lips. Alive, for now. The doctor had said the next hours were critical. Had used words like monitoring and complications and will know more soon. Had not said safe. Had not said guaranteed. The baby's fate remained a question mark. Possibility. A hope wrapped in statistics and medical protocols and the stubborn persistence of a heartbeat that refused to stop despite poison designed to disrupt it. They weren't out of danger. They might not be for days. But Kiana had woken up, had found him through fog and medication and fear, had used her one moment of consciousness to ask him to stay. So he would stay, would press his forehead against her hand until his neck seized, would listen to monitors measure things beyond his control, would wait in this too bright room while biology and chemistry fought their invisible war, would not chase Yuna, would not give in to rage, would not prove her right about what he was. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Min-jun closed his eyes and stayed. Min-jun made no calls to the men who used to handle problems. No late-night meetings in parking garages. No envelopes passed across tables. No instructions delivered in the careful language of plausible deniability that everyone understood meant violence. He didn't order a hit. Didn't arrange an accident. Didn't send the kind of message that left people hospitalized or disappeared or suddenly eager to relocate to different countries. The old Min-jun would have. The version Yuna remembered, the one she tried to expose, would have made her disappearance look like choice, would have ensured she understood consequences in ways that required reconstructive surgery and years of physical therapy. He didn't do that. Instead, he made a phone call to his attorney, then another to his accountant, then a series of emails to investigators who specialized in financial documentation, regulatory compliance, and the kind of deep research that turned rumors into evidence. He weaponized paperwork. Week 1. Yuna's primary bank account was frozen pending investigation into irregular transactions. Nothing dramatic. Just routine compliance review triggered by algorithmic detection of suspicious patterns. The patterns were real. Min-jun's forensic accountants had found them, years of transactions that lived in the gray space between legal and not, the kind that survived on lack of scrutiny rather than legitimacy. Now there was scrutiny. Week 2. Her access to the private investment club that had funded her lifestyle was quietly revoked.
No explanation.
Just an email. After careful review, we've decided to restructure our membership criteria. 3 of her largest clients received anonymous tips about discrepancies in her consulting invoices. Nothing actionable. Just enough to make them uncomfortable. Enough to make them choose different consultants for upcoming projects. Week 3. The allies she'd cultivated over years, other people who'd built their lives in the spaces between legal and legitimate, began distancing themselves. Not dramatically, not with pronouncements or confrontations. They just stopped returning calls, stopped including her in group messages, stopped appearing at the restaurants and galleries where they used to congregate. Word had spread, not about the poisoning, that remained between the people who'd witnessed it and the medical staff bound by privacy laws, but about who she'd targeted, about how that had been received. In their world, you survived by reading currents, by understanding which directions were safe and which led to drowning. Yuna's direction led to drowning. Week 4. The legal protections she'd relied on, lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear, connections who could make investigations stall, evaporated. Her attorney sent regrets. Conflict of interest. Couldn't specify which client created the conflict, but surely she understood. The detective who'd looked the other way on previous issues suddenly had a supervisor reviewing his case files. Couldn't take personal calls anymore. Very sorry. The city official who'd smoothed permits and overlooked violations got transferred to a different department. His replacement was distressingly by the book. Every wall she'd built crumbled in slow motion, not demolished, just allowed to deteriorate under the weight of attention and accountability. 5 weeks after the gala, Yuna stood in the lobby of Minjun's office building. She'd come because the alternative was waiting for whatever came next, and waiting had become intolerable. The walls were closing, the accounts were frozen, the allies were gone. Her life was contracting around her like a fist, and she needed to understand what he'd done, needed to see his face when she asked why he hadn't killed her. The elevator opened. Minjun stepped out alone. No security.
No entourage.
Just him in a suit that cost more than her remaining accessible funds. He saw her. Didn't look surprised. Yuna, what did you do? Her voice came out harder than intended. Anger masking fear. What did you do to me? Nothing. Liar. My accounts are being investigated by their own compliance departments. I didn't file the complaints. Algorithms did. My clients received information they deserved to have about billing irregularities you created. My lawyers found more lucrative clients. He said it without satisfaction. Just fact. I didn't threaten them. I didn't need to. She wanted to scream. Wanted to attack him right there in the lobby with its marble floors and expensive art and security cameras recording everything. But that's what he'd done, wasn't it? Made every space visible. Made violence impossible. Made her dissolve through systems and documentation and the simple act of allowing truth to surface. You wanted proof I hadn't changed, Minjun said. His voice was quiet, certain. I stayed exactly who my child deserves. The words hit harder than fists would have. Because she'd wanted him to be the monster. Needed him to be. It would have justified everything. Her choices, her life, her belief that people were fixed and transformation was theater. Instead, he'd proven that change was real. And that made her obsolescence complete. 6 weeks after the gala, the authorities arrived at Yuna's apartment with warrants. Not for murder. The poison hadn't killed. But attempted assault, reckless endangerment, tampering with food or drink with intent to harm. She didn't resist. There was nowhere left to run. No accounts to access. No allies to call. No lawyers available. Just consequences arriving on schedule. 7 weeks after the gala, the cry split the hospital room at 3:47 a.m. Loud, furious. The sound of someone profoundly displeased with their sudden arrival into cold air and harsh light. Minjun's hands shook as the doctor placed his daughter in his arms. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Black hair. Kiana's nose. His stubborn expression. According to the nurse who'd seen enough newborns to recognize personalities immediately. She's healthy, the doctor confirmed. Everything is healthy. Kiana lay exhausted in the bed, hair plastered to her forehead, smiling with every remaining ounce of energy. Told you she was stubborn, she whispered. Minjun couldn't speak, could only stare at the tiny human in his arms who depended on him to build a world worth living in. His daughter, his future, his reason for choosing restraint over rage. 3 months later, Minjun resigned from the charity gala board, stepped back from the social circuits that had consumed his evenings. The performance of respectability, the constant proof of transformation, the never-ending demonstration that he'd left violence behind. He didn't need to prove it anymore. The people who mattered knew. He spent his evenings at home instead, watching Kiana feed their daughter, learning to change diapers, discovering that power meant nothing compared to the weight of a sleeping child against his chest. The gala world moved on without him. Some said he'd retreated. Others claimed the poisoning had broken something fundamental. They were wrong. It had simply clarified what mattered. He'd built his first empire on fear. This second one, quieter, smaller, infinitely more valuable, he built on presence, on staying, on being exactly who his daughter deserved. The most terrifying thing he did was prove that love had changed him, and nothing could force him back. Stories like this only survive when people who value restraint, dignity, and legacy choose to support them. If this one meant something to you, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who would understand why it mattered. Thank you for being here.